Japanese submarine commanders laughed at the American sonar. Until their entire wolf pack vanished in a single night, the -58 cut through the black water of the Philippine Sea like a silent predator, her hull vibrating with the deep, reassuring hum of her diesel engines running on the surface. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto stood on the conning tower bridge, the warm, salty night air filling his lungs. He could taste the coming storm. To his right, the sleek silhouette of the -56 sliced through the gentle swell, and ahead, the -47 led their small pack. It was June 18, 1944. The moon was a sliver, the sky a blanket of stars, perfect hunting weather. Hashimoto, at 36, was a veteran of the brutal undersea war, a man who had seen the terror in merchant sailors' eyes through his periscope. He adjusted his cap, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the bridge railing. Below his feet, nestled in the forward torpedo room, were 6 chitin, human torpedoes, each piloted by a young, fervent volunteer awaiting their one-way ride to glory. But tonight, the conventional torpedoes would suffice. A low chuckle came from his executive officer, Lieutenant Tanaka, who stood beside him with a pair of binoculars. "The American picket line," Tanaka murmured, nodding toward the eastern horizon where nothing was visible. "They're destroyers. They ping away like blind men with sticks. We've slipped past their screen a dozen times. Their technology is loud, unsubtle, like the men who operate it." Hashimoto allowed himself a thin smile. He had heard the reports, read the intelligence bulletins disseminated by the 6th Fleet Command. American sonar, ASDIC, they sometimes called it, was a blunt instrument. It sent out its ping, ping, ping into the depths, a noisy announcement of the hunter's presence that any competent submariner could evade by diving deep, going silent, or hiding in thermal layers. Japanese submariners were artists of stealth. Their boats, like the -58, were designed for underwater agility and silence. American destroyer captains, by contrast, were seen as impatient, aggressive, and reliant on machinery over instinct. Their tactics were textbook and predictable: a patterned search, depth charges set for standard depths, a frantic chase if they got a sniff. Hashimoto and his comrades had trained to exploit that predictability. They believed, with the certainty born of years of successful patrols in 1942 and early 1943, that the ocean's darkness was their eternal ally. What Hashimoto could not know, as he scanned the empty sea, was that the intelligence he relied upon was a fossil. It was based on encounters from a year ago, on assessments of technology that had been obsolete before the reports even reached Tokyo. The ping, ping, ping his crew would soon hear would not be the clumsy probe of a blind man. It would be the precise, searching pulse of something new, something born in a frenzy of Allied scientific collaboration and American industrial might that the Imperial Japanese Navy's high command had dismissed as impossible. And the 3 submarines of his wolf pack were sailing not into a hunting ground, but into the first live-fire demonstration of a system so secret, so devastating, that its very existence would rewrite the rules of undersea warfare in a single, violent hour. The confidence of Hashimoto and the entire Japanese submarine force was built on a solid edifice of early war triumph. From December 1941 through 1942, Japanese submarines had ranged across the Pacific with near impunity. They had sunk aircraft carriers like the Yorktown at Midway, torpedoed battleships, and ravaged Allied supply lines. The I-boats were larger, had longer range, and often carried more potent torpedoes. The Type 95, powered by pure oxygen, left no bubbling wake and packed a devastating warhead. American anti-submarine warfare, ASW, in those early days was, by Japanese assessment, primitive. Their destroyers used sonar sets based on 1930s technology, with limited range and poor accuracy in rough seas or against a submarine that went deep. Their depth charges were often poorly fused, and their tactics lacked coordination. Captured American manuals, painstakingly translated, revealed standard search patterns that Japanese commanders learned to avoid with ease. The intelligence apparatus of the Imperial Navy, the Tokumu Kiken, fed this sense of superiority. Reports filtering up from submarine captains spoke of American sonar operators who seemed to lose contact the moment a submarine dove below 200 meters or cut its engines. A celebrated report from Commander Yahachi Tanabe of the Amenis 168, after his successful attack on the damaged Yorktown, noted that American destroyers had prosecuted their search with energy but little skill, their sonar echoes fading into the ocean's murmur. This became accepted doctrine. American technology was inferior, and their operators lacked the subtle, patient hunter's spirit of the Japanese. A cultural prejudice hardened into military certainty. American sailors were seen as reliant on comfort and machinery, unable to endure the psychological strain of the silent hunt or interpret the ocean's complex acoustics. Japanese submariners, by contrast, were taught to listen, to feel the water through their hull, to become one with their boat. They were samurai of the deep. This belief was reinforced by technical comparisons that, on paper, seemed irrefutable. Japanese sonar engineers had developed the Type 93 passive hydrophone array, an exceptionally sensitive listening device. Japanese submarine design prioritized silent running. Electric motors were meticulously balanced, machinery mounted on rubber isolators, hulls shaped for minimal hydrodynamic noise. They believed their boats were simply quieter, and their crews better trained to exploit that quiet, than anything the Americans could field. When vague reports from German allies in late 1943 mentioned new Allied ASW developments, they were discounted. The Germans, locked in their own brutal battle of the Atlantic, were seen as prone to exaggeration, their problems unique to the cold, shallow waters of the North Atlantic. The vast Pacific was a different realm, one where Japanese mastery seemed unassailable. A few voices dared to whisper caution. Captain Tsukudo, a staff officer at 6th Fleet Headquarters who studied after-action reports with a statistician's cold eye, noted a disturbing trend beginning in late 1943. The tonnage sunk by Japanese submarines began to drop, not gradually, but precipitously. Losses, meanwhile, started to climb. He compiled a memo highlighting encounters where American destroyers appeared to hold contact at unprecedented depths, or where their depth charge patterns were unnervingly accurate. He pointed to the sudden, unexplained losses of several veteran boats like the Amenis 32 and Amenis 180. His memo was stamped for review and filed away. The prevailing view, championed by senior commanders whose reputations were built on the old successes, was that these were anomalies, bad luck, crew error, or the inevitable statistical ebb and flow of war. To suggest the Americans had leapfrogged Japanese technological and tactical prowess was not just alarmist. It was an insult to the spirit of the Imperial Navy. Captain Tsukudo's warnings would be remembered, but only later, when it was far too late for the men at sea. What these commanders dismissed as propaganda or anomaly was, in reality, the terrifying output of an industrial and scientific juggernaut they had fundamentally misunderstood. While Japanese naval architects refined existing designs, America had declared total war on the submarine threat, mobilizing not just factories, but its greatest scientific minds. The centerpiece of this effort was a project so secret it was known only by a code name. Project Q. Its goal was not to improve existing sonar, but to render it obsolete. The problem with the old ping and listen active sonar was its giveaway pulse and its limited resolution. The solution, theorized by a team led by the brilliant, driven physicist Dr. Albert Al B. Fisk at the Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut, was a system that could see in 3 dimensions in near-total silence. They called it Q-sonar, but the operational name was then /SQ-4. Its principle was revolutionary. Instead of a single ping, It emitted a complex, fan-shaped beam of acoustic energy on a frequency spectrum the Japanese hydrophones were not tuned to detect. More crucially, it used a revolutionary new array of hydrophones. Not just one, but dozens, arranged in a retractable dome under the destroyer's bow. This array could not only hear the returning echo, but by comparing the minute differences in its arrival time at each hydrophone, it could compute the target's bearing, range, and depth with shocking accuracy. It was, for the first time, a true underwater searchlight, not a blind man's cane. The system's brain was the Q coordinator, an analog computer the size of a refrigerator that crunched the acoustic data in real time, plotting a target's course and speed on a rolling paper chart. An operator didn't just hear a vague echo. He watched a glowing green pip move across a screen, with a numerical readout of the target's depth in feet. The production numbers were beyond Japanese comprehension. While Japan struggled to produce a handful of advanced hydrophone sets per month, American industry went into overdrive. General Electric's plants in Syracuse were tooled to produce 300 SQ Sminis, 4 sonar domes per month, by early 1944. The Raytheon Corporation, mastering the complex magnetostrictive transducers, was churning out the hydrophone arrays on round-the-clock shifts. This wasn't a trickle of new technology to elite units. It was a flood. A destroyer escort, the small, cheap, mass-produced ASW vessel that Japanese admirals derided as a tin can, could be fitted with the system in a 5-day refit. By June 1944, over 200 Allied warships in the Pacific, from fleet destroyers down to the humble DEs, carried the Q-sonar. The Japanese believed they were facing an outdated fleet. They were, in fact, sailing into an ocean that had suddenly become transparent to their enemies. The human element was equally transformed. The U.S. Navy established the Fleet Sonar School in Key West, Florida, and another in San Diego, where operators were put through a grueling, months-long curriculum. They trained on simulators that recreated the sounds of different submarine types, ocean conditions, and evasion tactics. They weren't just taught to listen, they were taught to analyze. A new rating was created, Sonarman SO. These men, many of them young electronics whizzes from across America, learned to distinguish the metallic ping of a returning echo from a Japanese I-boat's hull from the softer return of a whale or a thermal layer. They practiced coordinating attacks with other ships, using TBS talk between ships, radio to box in a target. The old, individualistic destroyer captain charging in for the kill was being replaced by a networked team, a pack of hunters guided by a shared, precise picture of the underwater battlefield. This new breed of sailor was the perfect complement to the machine he operated, cool, technical, and lethally efficient. The system had its birth pangs. Early prototypes in 1943 suffered from oscillator failures, dome leaks, and computer glitches that produced phantom targets. Dr. Fisk and his team, working in a converted warehouse, often slept on cots beside their equipment. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A young engineer named Ruthie Feldman, one of the many Rossi the Riveters who entered technical fields, who redesigned the dome's hydraulic retraction system to prevent saltwater corrosion that was scrambling the signals. Another team at MIT's Radiation Lab miniaturized the Q coordinator's vacuum tubes, making it robust enough for the violent shocks of depth-charge explosions. By February 1944, during sea trials off Bermuda, the USS Bari, DD-704, successfully tracked and simulated attacks on a U.S. submarine at 350 yards, maintaining a solid contact even as the sub dove below 500 feet and tried every evasion maneuver in the book. The report from the exercise, marked Top Secret Project Q, concluded with a sentence that would have chilled Hashimoto's blood. The tactical advantage conferred is decisive. Submarine evasion, as currently practiced by Axis powers, is ineffective. The first, Fragmentary hints of this new reality began to lap against the consciousness of the Japanese submarine force like faint, troubling ripples. In March 1944, the ominous 105, on patrol near the Admiralty Islands, reported a bizarre encounter. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Takashi, radioed a cryptic message. Enemy destroyer made contact at extreme range. Held contact through deep dive and silent running. Depth charge pattern was precise. Suspect new detection method. The message was received at truck, but the duty officer, reviewing the log of R-105's previous missions, which included several unconfirmed sinkings, attributed the report to combat fatigue and possible damage to hydrophones. The R-105 was lost with all hands 2 weeks later. Her final, frantic transmission about continuous pinging from multiple bearings was filed under cause unknown. In April, it was the -42. Her experienced captain reported being hunted for over 8 hours by a single American destroyer escort. The enemy ship did not rush, he reported. It stalked, it knew my depth, it would drift silent then move to cut off my turns. Its pings were different, a sharper, higher tone. This report reached Captain Tsukudo's desk. He appended it to his growing file and forwarded it to the Bureau of Naval Weapons with a red stamp. The Bureau's acoustics experts, examining the description, theorized it might be a variant of British ASDIC Type 144, and assured the fleet that Japanese hydrophones could detect its transmissions. They were wrong. The Q-sonar's frequency was just outside the optimal range of the Type 93 array. To a Japanese sonar operator, it would sound like a faint, almost ghostly whisper of background noise, easily mistaken for ocean static or the destroyer's own machinery. The most compelling warning came from a source the Japanese high command trusted implicitly: the Germans. In May 1944, a diplomatic pouch from the Kriegsmarine's headquarters in Berlin arrived via submarine. It contained a detailed technical assessment of new Allied ASW tactics in the Atlantic, mentioning high-definition sonar with bearing rate indication and coordinated hunter-killer groups. The German assessment was blunt. The Allies have achieved a qualitative leap. Our U-boats are suffering catastrophic losses. We urge the Imperial Navy to reconsider deep-diving evasion tactics. This report was discussed at a 6th Fleet staff meeting. The conclusion, influenced by a deep-seated belief in Japanese uniqueness and Pacific exceptionalism, was that the German experience in the congested Atlantic was not applicable to the vastness of the Pacific. The German warning, like Captain Tsukudo's memos, was shelved. The cultural blind spot was complete. They believed their boats were better, their men were better, and their ocean was different. This was the atmosphere of unshakable, yet dangerously brittle, confidence that surrounded Commander Hashimoto as he gave the order to dive. The clock on the -58's control room bulkhead read 22:17. Radar had picked up a faint surface contact to the east, a lone ship, perhaps a tanker or a freighter lagging behind a convoy. A perfect target for a night surface attack. The Wolfpack would coordinate. The A-47 would make the first approach, with Hashimoto's A-58 and the A-56 positioned to intercept any fleeing vessels. Clear the bridge. Dive, dive, the klaxon blared. The lookout scrambled down the hatch. Hashimoto took one last look at the starry sky before descending, the hatch clanging shut above him with a final metallic thud. The diesels coughed and went silent. The electric motors took over with a low whine. The boat tilted forward, plainsmen at their wheels, as she slid beneath the waves. The air grew thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and ozone from the electrical systems. The only light was the red glow of the instrument panels, reflecting off the intent faces of his crew. "Depth 50 meters, the diving officer called out. "Level off at 60 meters, Hashimoto ordered, his voice calm. "Battle stations. Torpedo tubes 1 through 4 prepare for surface firing. Hydrophone, report contacts." At the hydrophone station, Petty Officer Kenta slipped on his headphones, his eyes closing in concentration. The sound world of the deep ocean filled his ears. The distant groan of a passing whale, the crackle of shrimp, the white noise of the sea. Then the expected sound, the faint, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of a single screw. A merchant. He reported the bearing. Hashimoto nodded, plotting the intercept on his chart. The hunt was proceeding exactly as 100 drills had dictated. Then Kenta stiffened. His eyes snapped open. A new sound had entered his headphones. Not from the merchant, from the east. A high-frequency ping, but unlike any he had ever heard. It was sharper, cleaner, less of a resonant tone and more of a crisp, clicking pulse. And it was scanning. He could hear the sound sweeping through the water like a slow, methodical searchlight. "Commander," Kenta said, his voice tight. "Active sonar, bearing 085, high frequency. It is unusual." Hashimoto felt the first tiny seed of disquiet. Unusual. The American sonar was supposed to be a low-frequency thud. Range. "Difficult to say, sir. The return is very faint on our array. It does not match known profiles. Estimating, maybe 8,000 meters. 8 kilometers. That was extreme range for the old American sets to hold a solid contact." Hashimoto pushed the unease aside. It was probably a destroyer on a random search pattern, pinging aimlessly. Its sound was odd because of ocean conditions, a thermal layer bending the acoustics. "Monitor it," he ordered. "Maintain course for intercept. The primary target is the merchant." On the surface, the ocean was a flat, dark plain under the star-speckled sky. The ship whose screws Kenta heard was the USS Raymond, D-341, a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort. 1,350 tons of welded steel built in 90 days at the Consolidated Steel Corporation yard in Orange, Texas. On her bridge, Lieutenant Commander John D. Jack Harlan, USNR, a former insurance adjuster from Toledo, Ohio, watched the soft green glow of the Q-sonar repeater. The operator, Sonarman Second Class Frank Petrowski, a Polish kid from Chicago who had fixed radios before the war, spoke calmly into his headset microphone. His voice piped to the bridge. "Contact designated Sierra 1, bearing 085 relative, range 8,200 yards, depth estimate 600 feet, course 270, speed 4 knots. Classification, submerged submarine. I'm getting a strong return, Captain. Hull is large, signature matches I-boat profile in the book." Harlan didn't hesitate. The Raymond was not alone. She was part of Task Unit 77.41, a hunter-killer group built around the small escort carrier USS Fanchel Bay. Her sisters, the USS Dennis, D-405, and USS John C. Butler, D-339, were 10 miles to the north and south. Their own Q-sonar domes extended into the water. Harlan keyed the TBS. "Greyhound, this is Pointer. Tally-ho. 1 Fox in the den, bearing 085, range 8,000, depth 600 feet, and proceeding to investigate. Request you take stations to the north and west." A crackled reply came back. "Pointer, Greyhound copies. We're moving. Keep us painted." "Wilco." Harlan turned to his officer of the deck. "All ahead full. Come to course 085. Sound general quarters. Tell the depth charge crews to stand by. We're going to ping this fellow." Aboard the -58, the ping, ping, ping grew steadily louder. It was no longer faint. It was clear, insistent, and it was holding a constant bearing. Hashimoto's earlier disquiet bloomed into full alarm. A random search pattern would have wandered. This was tracking. "Hydrophone. What is the Doppler?" he demanded, asking for the change in pitch that would indicate whether the source was moving toward or away. Kenta listened, his face pale in the red light. "The pitch is rising, Commander. The source is closing." "Rapidly? Impossible. At this range, with their boat at silent running speed, the old American sonar should have lost them in the background clutter." "Increase depth, 100 meters. Rig for silent running. All non-essential systems off." The -58 tilted downward again, her crew moving with practiced quiet. The electric motors were dialed back to their slowest, quietest setting. The ventilation fans were shut off. The men stood or sat frozen, barely breathing, listening to the rhythmic ping, ping, ping that now seemed to come from directly overhead. On the Raymond, Petrovsky watched his screen. The green pip representing Sierra One didn't fade or break up as it dove deeper. It remained solid, its course and speed updating smoothly. Captain, target has increased depth to 100 meters. Speed reduced to 2 knots. He's gone quiet. Harlan smiled thinly. He's following the book. Helm, come right to 090. We'll run right over him. Sonar, give me a firing solution for Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was another American innovation the Japanese knew little about. It was a forward-throwing mortar that launched a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a set depth and gave a submarine time to maneuver, the Hedgehog bombs only exploded if they actually hit the submarine. And to aim them, you needed to know the target's exact position in 3 dimensions, the very thing Q-Sonar provided. Solution ready, Captain, Petrovsky announced. Range now 4,000 yards, depth 110 meters. Course steady. Hashimoto stood in the center of the control room, the ping, 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 now a physical presence, a heartbeat of impending doom thrumming through the hull. He could hear the high-pitched whine of the destroyer's screws as they passed directly overhead. Then the screws faded slightly. He waited for the splash and deep thump of depth charges. It didn't come. Instead, there was a new sound, a series of smaller, sharper splashes, like stones being thrown into the water in a quick, patterned sequence. "What was that?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, the world exploded. The first Hedgehog bomb missed the -58's pressure hull by 12 feet, its contact fuse detonating against the water with a muffled crump. The second was closer. The third struck the aft port side of the conning tower fairing. The detonation was not the massive, concussive blast of a depth charge, but a localized, savage hammer blow of high explosive against steel. Lights shattered. Men were thrown from their feet. A scream echoed from the aft torpedo room as a steam line ruptured. The boat shuddered violently, listing to port. "Damage report," Hashimoto yelled over the ringing in his ears and the sudden, terrifying hiss of escaping air. "Breach in the conning tower casing, taking on water in the aft battery compartment. Motors are damaged." The ping, ping, ping never stopped. It was circling now. The destroyer was coming back for another pass. Hashimoto's mind raced. This was not a depth charge attack. They had been hit by something else, something that required a direct hit, which meant the enemy knew exactly where they were. The reports, the warnings, they were all true. The cold, absolute certainty of it flooded him. They were not just being hunted, they were being seen. On the surface, Harlan received a TBS call. "Pointer, this is Watchdog. We have a new contact. Designated Sierra 2. Bearing 350 from you, range 12,000 yards, depth 80 meters. Another I-boat. He's heard the fireworks and is trying to run." It was the -56. Harlan made a decision. "Watchdog, you and Greyhound take Sierra 2. We have Sierra 1 crippled. We'll finish him and then join you." "Roger, Pointer. Engaging Sierra 2. Aboard the -56, Commander Toyojiro Hara had heard the distant, muffled explosions and the terrifyingly clear pings that seemed to fill the ocean. He had ordered an emergency deep dive to 150 meters and was running at full silent speed, trying to put distance between himself and the disaster befalling the -58. His hydrophone operator was frantic. "Commander, I hear 3 separate sonar sources. Different bearings, they are coordinating." Hara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the deepening cold of the hull. A coordinated hunt by multiple ships, maintaining contact at this depth and speed. It defied all his training and experience. "Release decoy," he ordered. The chiton could be jettisoned as a noisemaker. A metallic clang echoed through the boat as the human torpedo was released, its motor programmed to run in a circle. It would create a loud, confusing acoustic signature. On the USS Dennis, the sonar operator frowned. Captain Sierra 2 has just launched something small and noisy. It's circling, might be a decoy. The Dennis captain, a young Annapolis graduate named Lewis, didn't hesitate. Ignore it. The Q coordinator can filter that out. Maintain contact on the main hull signature. He's trying to slip away to the northwest. Let's box him in with Watchdog. Back on the crippled Eminis 58, Hashimoto was fighting a losing battle. The flooding in the aft compartment was worsening. The dive planes were jammed. They were stuck at 120 meters, slowly sinking tail first. The ping, ping, ping was now accompanied by the sound of 2 more sets of screws, other destroyers arriving. He heard faintly through the water the distant crump, crump, crump of another hedgehog attack miles away, the Eminis 47. They were getting the Eminis 47 too. "Commander," the radio operator shouted, holding a headphone to one ear. "A signal from Eminis 56. Under attack by multiple hunters. New sonar cannot evade, and making final dive. Tenohika Banzai." Then static. Hashimoto closed his eyes. The entire wolf pack. They were being systematically annihilated in a battle they couldn't even see, by an enemy who knew their every move. The arrogance of the high command, the dismissed reports, the cultural contempt, it all crystallized into a single, devastating truth in that red-lit control room. They had laughed at American technology. They had believed their spirit and skill would prevail. They were wrong. They were so terribly, fatally wrong. On the bridge of the Raymond, Harlan watched as Petrovsky gave the final solution. "Target is dead in the water, Captain. Depth 130 meters and sinking by the stern. He's finished." "Very well. Stand by depth charges. Set for 150 meters. We'll give him the coup de grace." As the order was given, Hashimoto, in a final, desperate act, ordered the chiton pilots to prepare for launch. It was a suicide order. They couldn't surface, and the human torpedoes had no chance in the deep water. But it was the only weapon he had left. The young pilots, their faces grim and resolute in the emergency lighting, nodded and began their final rituals. The Raymond thundered over the spot, her stern racks and K-guns unleashing a full pattern of depth charges. They sank into the dark, their hydrostatic pistols set for deep detonation. Aboard the Eminis 58, Hashimoto heard the splashes, then the terrifying sound of the canisters sinking through the water toward them. He looked at the photo of his wife and daughter, tucked into the corner of his chart table. The first depth charge exploded at 140 meters, a colossal boom that slammed the hull and blew out the remaining lights. The second was closer. The third. The ocean above the dying Eminis 58 erupted in a boiling cauldron of white water and flame as the depth charges detonated in a coordinated symphony of destruction. On the Raymond's sonar screen, the solid green pip that was Sierra 1 flared into a cloud of scattered echoes, then dissolved into nothingness. "Contact lost," Petrovsky said, his voice flat. "Target destroyed." Harlan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Nice work, Sonar. Now let's go help the others with the second contact." But as he turned to give the helm an order, Petrovsky's voice cut through again, sharp with renewed tension. "Captain, new contact. Designated Sierra 3. Bearing 170, range 9,000 yards. Depth 100 meters. It's big, bigger than the others, and it's not running." Petrovsky paused, listening intently to his headphones, his eyes wide. "Sir, I'm picking up multiple high-speed screw noises in the water around it. Smaller contacts. They're separating from the main hull, 6 of them, heading in different directions. Sir, I think it just launched all of its torpedoes. But the bearings, they're not aimed at us. They're fanning out, and one is turning. Its bearing is changing rapidly. It's coming right for us." The high-speed screw Petrovsky heard wasn't a conventional torpedo. It was a chiton, and its pilot, Ensign Kenji Yoshida, 21 years old, was not aiming at the destroyer's sound signature. He was aiming at the source of the pings themselves, the rhythmic pulses that were painting his mother submarine for death. In the cramped, oxygen-fetid cylinder of the human torpedo, Yashida's world was a single periscope, a steering wheel, and a depth gauge. He had heard the distant thunder of depth charges killing the -58, felt the shockwaves through the water. His orders, received in the chaos of the -47's own desperate evasion, were simple: attack any warship. But his training screamed something else: kill the hunter. The pinging was a beacon. He pushed his throttle to maximum, the chitin's single propeller biting the water, driving the one-ton craft forward at 30 knots. He had maybe 3 minutes of fuel left. It was enough. On the Raymond, Harlan's mind processed the information with a speed born of training and adrenaline. 6 contacts, fanning out, 1 turning. Hard left rudder, all ahead flank. Sound the alarm for torpedo attack. The destroyer escort heeled over sharply, her screws churning the black water to foam. The pinging stopped as the sonar dome was retracted for high-speed maneuvering. For a moment there was only the roar of the engines and the tense silence on the bridge. Then from the starboard side a lookout screamed, "Torpedo wake! Starboard beam! Close!" It was Yashida's chitin. In his final seconds, he had seen the dark silhouette of the Raymond against the starry sky and corrected course. The wake was not the bubbling trail of a compressed-air torpedo. It was a faint, phosphorescent line, the disturbance of a small, fast-moving object just below the surface. It missed the Raymond's stern by less than 10 yards, streaking past into the darkness before its engine cut out and it sank, undetonated, to the bottom. Yashida's last sight was the immense black wall of the ship's hull passing him by, close enough to touch. But the chitin attack, while a terrifying shock, was a distraction. The real threat was Sierra 3, the -47 herself. Commander Suzumu Oda, a legend in the submarine force with 5 confirmed kills, had used the chitin launch as an acoustic smokescreen. While the American sonar operators were momentarily confused by the 6 high-speed, diverging contacts, Oda had ordered a radical maneuver. He had blown his main ballast tanks in a violent, noisy emergency surface, not to fight, but to run on his diesels. The -47 broke the surface 2 miles from the Raymond, a dark, whale-like shape silhouetted against the horizon, and immediately began pouring out a thick, chemical smoke screen from canisters on her deck while turning to flee northwest at 18 knots. Harlan saw the plume of smoke blossom on the horizon. "He's surfaced. He's making a run for it. All guns engage." The Raymond's 5-inch gun and her 40 Bofors mount swung around, their tracers arcing red across the water. But the range was extreme and the smoke screen was effective. Shells splashed harmlessly around the fleeing submarine. Harlan keyed the TBS. "All units, pointer. Sierra 3 has surfaced and is fleeing northwest, making smoke. I am in pursuit. Request Greyhound and Watchdog intercept." Aboard the -47, Oda stood on the conning tower, the acrid smoke burning his lungs but hiding his boat. He had heard the destruction of the -58 and the final transmission from the -56. He understood. The American sonar was a predator they could not hide from underwater. His only chance was to outrun them on the surface, using the darkness and his boat's superior surface speed, a desperate gamble that acknowledged the old rules were dead. His hydrophone operator below shouted up the hatch, multiple screw sounds converging. At least 2 more destroyers, bearing 310 and 280. "They are cutting off our escape." It was the USS Dennis and USS John C. Butler. Guided by Harlan's calls and their own Q-sonar, which had easily tracked the -47's noisy surface run, they had maneuvered to intercept. They did not need to see the submarine through the smoke. Their radar had her, a clear blip at 8,000 yards, and they had speed. The John C. Butler-class DEs could make 24 knots, faster than the -47's best surface dash. The trap was closing. Oda saw the muzzle flashes first from the port side, then from ahead. Shells began walking closer, throwing up geysers of white water. A 5-inch round from the Dennis struck the water just off the -47's bow, the concussion slamming into the hull. Another from the John C. Butler ripped through the smoke and struck the aft deck gun, obliterating it and its crew in a fireball that lit up the night. Oda was thrown to the deck of the bridge, his ear ringing. He looked up through the clearing smoke and saw the silhouettes of two destroyers, one on either beam, their guns flashing rhythmically. It was a classic surface gunnery execution. The ocean around his submarine was a maelstrom of shell splashes. There was no more stealth, no more evasion. The samurai of the deep had been forced into a gunfight, and he was hopelessly outgunned. "Dive! Dive!" Oda screamed, scrambling for the hatch, but it was too late. A 40 shell ripped through the conning tower, killing the executive officer beside him. Another struck the base of the tower, jamming the hatch. The -47, mortally wounded, began to slow, her hull riddled with holes. Oda, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, made his way below through the secondary hatch. The control room was chaos. Lights flickering, men shouting, the shriek of tearing metal from more hits. "Flood all tanks. Take her down. Make depth," he ordered, his voice raw. The -47 slipped beneath the waves for the last time, water pouring in through a dozen rents in her pressure hull. She went down fast, nose first. Oda stood braced at his station as the depth gauge spun wildly past 100 meters, then 150. The crushing pressure finished what the guns had started. With a final, deafening groan of collapsing steel, the -47 imploded, taking Commander Oda and all 101 hands with her. The entire wolf pack, 3 frontline submarines, 17 officers, and 212 enlisted men, had been destroyed in less than 90 minutes of combat. On the Raymond, Harlan watched the last of the bubbles and oil slicks spread on the surface where the -47 had gone down. The night was quiet again, save for the rumble of his own engines. The TBS crackled. Pointer, Greyhound. Sierra 2 confirmed destroyed. Hedgehog hit, we're watching the debris field. A pause. Watchdog confirms, no further contacts, ocean is clear. Harlan leaned against the bridge wing, suddenly exhausted. They had just wiped out an entire submarine wolf pack without a single casualty, without even a scratch on their paint. It felt less like a battle and more like a clinical dissection. "Secure from general quarters," he said quietly. "Set condition III. Resume patrol station." He looked at Petrovsky, who had emerged from the sonar shack, his face pale but triumphant. "You did good work tonight, son." "Thank you, sir. The equipment did most of it. It was like he was painted on the screen." That was the terrifying truth, Harlan thought. The -58, the -56, the -47, they hadn't stood a chance. Their skill, their courage, their years of training had been rendered irrelevant by a green glow on a screen in a tin can built in 90 days. The war beneath the waves had just changed forever, and the Japanese didn't even know it yet. But they would learn. The lesson of June 18, 1944 in the Philippine Sea was not an isolated incident. It was the opening note of a requiem for the entire Imperial Japanese submarine force. In the weeks that followed, the hunter-killer groups equipped with Q-sonar and hedgehogs, operating around the Marianas invasion fleet, began a slaughter of unprecedented scale. The Japanese Submarine Command, still operating on the old intelligence, continued to send boats into what they believed were vulnerable Allied shipping lanes. They were, in fact, sending them into a sonic killing field. On July 2, the R-114 and R-117 were detected by the USS England, D-635, a destroyer escort whose crew would become the most deadly ASW unit in history. Using Q-sonar, the England tracked the R-114 for an hour, then destroyed it with a single hedgehog pattern. The next day, she repeated the feat on the R-117. Within 2 weeks, the England would sink 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days, a feat that would earn her a Presidential Unit Citation and permanently etch the name England into Japanese naval lore as a ghost ship, a phantom that could see in the dark. The statistics were catastrophic. In the second quarter of 1944, Japanese submarine losses had averaged 4 boats per month. In July 1944, following the full deployment of Sonar groups, that number skyrocketed to 17. By August, it was 19. The tonnage of Allied shipping sunk by Japanese submarines, which had peaked at over 600,000 tons in 1942, plummeted to 47,000 tons in the last half of 1944. The ratio of losses was unsustainable. For every Allied merchant ship sunk, Japan was now losing 3.8 submarines. The ocean had become a one-way street to the bottom. In the quiet, wood-paneled offices of the 6th Fleet headquarters at Kure, the warnings of Captain Tsukudo could no longer be ignored. The reports piled up on his desk, each more desperate than the last. The Aminus-26, lost with all hands off the Admiralties. The Aminus-29, caught on the surface by aircraft from a hunter-killer group and strafed until it sank. The R-48, whose final message was a single broken phrase, "The pings are everywhere. They can see us." Tsukudo compiled a new report, this one filled with hard numbers. He calculated that at the current loss rate, the entire operational submarine force, some 60 boats, would be annihilated within 18 months. He presented it to Vice Admiral Tadashige Daigo, commander of the 6th Fleet. Daigo, a submariner from the old school, stared at the figures. His face was ashen. "This cannot be," he murmured. "Our boats are the best in the world, our men." "Our men are dying, Admiral," Tsukudo said softly, "risking everything. The Americans have a new device. It is not sonar as we know it. It sees depth. It holds contact through every evasion. The German reports were correct." The High Command's reaction was a mixture of denial and fatalism. Orders were issued for submarines to remain submerged during the day, to operate only in shallow waters where thermal layers might offer some protection, to attack only at periscope depth with extreme caution. But these were defensive measures, admissions of defeat. The aggressive, offensive spirit of the submarine force was broken. A new, grim term entered the vocabulary of the submariners: Mortsu na Teki no Kikken, the ferocious enemy machine. Morale, once sky-high, began to crumble. Veteran commanders requested transfers to surface ships. Newly commissioned officers went to their first patrols with the resigned air of men walking to their funeral. The technological gap was not just in detection. It was in every aspect of the duel. While American shipyards launched a new destroyer escort every 3 days, Japan struggled to replace lost submarines. The Aminus-58, for example, had taken 18 months to build at the Kure Naval Arsenal. The American response to a submarine threat was not just one ship, but a networked group. A single sighting would trigger a call that could bring a half-dozen DEs and an escort carrier's aircraft into the hunt within hours. The Japanese submarine, operating alone as per doctrine, was isolated and doomed. The perspective from other theaters confirmed the disaster. Take the experience of Lieutenant Commander Toshio Kusaka of the Aminus 177, operating off the coast of New Guinea in August 1944. He was a veteran of 7 patrols, a survivor of the brutal Solomon Islands campaign. On August 28, he detected a small convoy and moved in for an attack. He never even got to fire his torpedoes. "The first ping was different," he would recount after the war, one of the few commanders to survive the carnage. "It was like a thin, sharp needle piercing the water. My hydrophone operator said it was faint, probably distant, but it held our bearing. We went deep to 120 meters, silent running. The ping followed us. It was as if they had a string tied to our hull. Then we heard the splashes, not depth charges, but the hedgehog. We knew about it by then from fragmentary reports. It was the sound of death. One hit forward. The explosion was intimate. It broke our back. As we sank, I could hear through the hull the pings from 2, maybe 3 other ships circling above us like vultures. They were talking to each other. I could hear their sonar pulses overlapping. We were not just hunted. We were orchestrated. Kusaka and 8 others miraculously escaped from the sinking -177 and were picked up by an American destroyer. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Colorado, where his technical knowledge was eagerly debriefed by U.S. Navy intelligence. The Americans showed him a schematic of the SQ-4 sonar dome. Kusaka stared at it for a long time, then laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "We thought you were clumsy giants," he said through the interpreter. "We were the ants thinking we could hide in the grass, but you had simply put on your spectacles." The German allies, watching from afar with their own mounting horror, sent another, more urgent warning in September 1944. This one came from Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz himself, addressed personally to the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin. It read, "The Allied ASW capability has undergone a revolution. The combination of high-definition sonar, forward-throwing weapons, and coordinated air-surface groups has made the Central Atlantic impassable for U-boats. Our losses exceed 70% of boats on patrol. We strongly advise the Imperial Navy to withdraw all submarines from open ocean patrols and concentrate solely on coastal defense. Any other course is suicide." This time, the report was not shelved. It was discussed in a somber meeting of the Naval General Staff. But the strategic situation was desperate. With the loss of the Marianas and the impending invasion of the Philippines, submarines were one of the few weapons left that could strike at the American fleet. The decision, a tragic compromise between reality and necessity, was to continue operations, but to shift tactics toward chitin attacks, suicide missions that acknowledged the near impossibility of a conventional submarine surviving to deliver its payload. The submarine force was being transformed from a strategic weapon into a delivery system for martyrs. The human cost was staggering. Of the approximately 190 submarines the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned during the war, 128 were lost. The majority of these, over 80, were sunk in 1944-1945, the period of Q-sonar dominance. The mortality rate for Japanese submariners became the highest of any branch of service in any major navy in World War II. An estimated 80% perished. Whole training classes from the Edejima Naval Academy were wiped out before they could complete 3 patrols. The average life expectancy of a Japanese submarine on patrol in late 1944 was measured in weeks. For the Americans, the impact was transformative. The previously terrifying threat of Japanese submarines, which had decimated the fleet at Pearl Harbor and stalked every task force, was virtually eliminated. The massive invasion fleets for Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa sailed with minimal submarine interference. Logistics, the lifeblood of the Pacific Advance, flowed unimpeded. The Q-sonar, coupled with the breaking of the Japanese naval codes, turned the vastness of the Pacific from a hiding ground for predators into a transparent highway for American power. The final, symbolic end for the conventional Japanese submarine force came in April 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa. A last-ditch effort, Operation Tan, sent 8 submarines, including some of the largest I-boats ever built, to attack the American fleet. It was a massacre. 6 were sunk by destroyer escorts and aircraft from hunter-killer groups before they could even get within 50 miles of the invasion force. The 7th was depth-charged by a blimp. Only one, the -58, ironically the same number as Hashimoto's lost boat but a different vessel, survived to score a tragic late-war success, the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, a final, isolated sting from a dying wasp. The aftermath of this technological revolution was studied with a kind of horrified fascination by Japanese naval engineers after the war. When they were given access to captured SQ-4 equipment and the technical reports from Project Q, their reaction was one of profound shock and reluctant admiration. Commander Eiji Sakuma, a former submarine designer tasked with the analysis for the War History Office, wrote in his 1946 assessment. We examined the American sonar array. The hydrophone design was elegant, but not beyond our theoretical understanding. The true genius was in the deployment. They had miniaturized and ruggedized a laboratory system for mass production. The Q-coordinator computer alone contained more precision wiring than our entire Type 93 sonar suite. But the most devastating realization was the production scale. We learned that the Raytheon Corporation produced more hydrophone elements in 1 week than our entire naval industry produced in a year. We were not defeated by a better idea alone. We were defeated by a system that could turn that idea into 10,000 working units before we could even finish the prototype. The personal stories of those who survived the culling painted a picture of a force psychologically shattered. Lieutenant Tanaka, Hashimoto's executive officer on the Eminis 58 who had laughed at the American picket line, was not aboard that night. He had been transferred to a training command 2 weeks earlier due to illness. He spent the rest of the war teaching sonar evasion tactics he knew were obsolete to cadets he knew were being sent to their deaths. In his diary, found after the surrender, he wrote, "I teach them the dance of the shadow, how to slip between the pulses of the blind man's cane. But in my heart, I know the Americans have lit a lamp. The dance is over. The ocean is no longer dark." Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto's personal effects, his cap, his binoculars, the photo of his family, were eventually returned to his widow by the U.S. Navy via the Swiss Red Cross in 1949, along with a letter stating his boat had been lost in action in the Philippine Sea with all hands. No details were given. She never learned about the Q-sonar, the hedgehogs, or the 90-minute battle that erased her husband's world. She only knew he had gone to sea, and the sea had kept him. The legacy of that single night in June 1944 extended far beyond the war. It established the template for modern anti-submarine warfare, networked sensors, coordinated hunter-killer groups, and the relentless integration of new technology. The scientists of Project Q would go on to found companies and lead research divisions that dominated the Cold War's underwater listening game. Ruthie Feldman, the engineer who fixed the dome retraction system, would later work on the SOSUS underwater listening network that would track Soviet submarines for decades. And for the few Japanese submarine commanders who lived to see the peace, the memory of those pings never faded. At the war crimes trials in Tokyo, Commander Hashimoto, the survivor of the later Eminis 58, not the one lost in this story, was called as a witness for the prosecution in the case against the Indianapolis captain. He was asked about his attack methods. He described them in detail, then added, unprompted, a quiet postscript. "By 1945, we were all dead men. The Americans could hear the grass grow. We were just waiting for our turn." The ocean, once a realm of imperial ambition and silent conquest, had been conquered by a different kind of empire, one built not on the spirit of the warrior, but on the unglamorous, relentless power of the applied mind, the production line, and the green glow of a screen in the dark. The laughter of the Japanese submarine commanders had died in their throats, replaced by the silent, chilling realization that the darkness they trusted had been stolen from them, one piercing, precise ping at a time. The entire wolf pack hadn't just vanished. It had been made visible, and then, methodically, erased from a sea that was no longer theirs.